Apologies for the slight delay. Well, welcome to Workshop 123, which is the title Public Sector Information Online Towards a Global Policy Framework. And welcome to all those that are maybe listening across the world and remotely connected to the workshop, either as individual world citizens or through groups, through remote hubs. Welcome to you all. I would like to thank at this early stage the scribers, who we need to keep in mind when we speak. And when we do speak, don't speak too fast, and ensure that you always, when you speak, that you identify yourself first so that your name actually appears on the transcript, which is important. I would also like to thank two other people. First, which is Keisha Taylor, sitting over here from Trinidad and Tobago, who's actually our remote moderator. And another person who is not here, she's actually in the UK, who's been doing the publicity for this workshop, so she's been busy tweeting and things like that, you may have seen over the recent months, who is Mary Ganoli. My name is Christopher Corbin, I'm from the UK, and I will be moderating this session. And what I now am going to do is to ask each of the panel members to briefly provide their name, their affiliation, and say one sentence on their role within the public sector information reuse community. And for the purposes of the scribers, there's two changes to the panel who are sitting on the far left, and you'll need to grab their names as we go along. So I'll start off with Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne Fitzgerald. Hi, I'm Anne Fitzgerald. I'm from QUT in Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. I have been involved with policy and legal frameworks for access to public sector information and access to educational resources over about the last 5 or so years, including the use of Creative Commons in the public sector.
Hello, I'm Walford Ritter. I'm based in Hong Kong and I work for a public policy think tank on open information and PSI. And I'm following PSI policies in Europe, India and Hong Kong, China. And I'm interested in the economic value creation and innovation through PSI. And I have been working on this topic for the past 4 or 5 years also. Thank you.
Well, I am Abhishek Singh. I am from the Government of India. I work in the Department of Information Technology, and I am associated with the National E-Governance Plan with various initiatives to take e-government services right up to the people. And in particular, right now we are working on a right to services, which will be right to electronic delivery of services, which will be a follow-up on the Right to Information Act that we had enacted some time back. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rajeshri from Center for Science Development Media Studies. I'm a senior program specialist in the center, and we work in the space of ICT for governance, and our role is primarily bringing the knowledge information together and disseminating the information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panel. Now I'd like to just give a few words to put the workshop into context and bring a few things to your attention. First, I hope you've all had a chance to download the background paper, which is about 30 pages long, which you can get off the IGF website 123 by pressing the background paper link. We have also published as an input to this workshop a paper produced by Keisha over here, which is a status report on all the countries within the Caribbean area. And why we're interested in this is that this area is made up predominantly of small islands, and when we're looking at policy, how do we actually deal with areas of that size? That report will be published on the IGF website when we publish our final report of this workshop, and it's already online on the European Public Sector Information Platform, which is URL www.epsiplatform.eu. The European PSI platform, in fact, is the huge resource of information about public sector information reuse policy as it is applied within the European Union. If you have never visited it, I would suggest you do if you're really interested in this subject. together with others in the United States, Australia, and Spain. The third item I just want to briefly mention is that throughout the time of the IGF6, we have been undertaking via Keisha an awareness survey, and if you've not already completed that survey, please do so. Keisha has them there, and we're going to collate the summaries of that, and that will be included in the report from this workshop. Now, this workshop itself actually builds upon the workshop which was presented at Vilnius in IGF5, and you can find the in your book, which was handed out to you in your red or green folder, on pages 223 to 225, the report of that. And that is also now online, I understand, on the IGF website. So you can actually look at that on the IGF site. The other item I want to draw your attention, which is relevant to this workshop, which is in your green and red bag, is this document on the European Union digital agenda. And you see that it includes lots of the topics which are being discussed here at the IGF6, but on page 9 it talks about what European Union is doing with regards to public sector information. Now, this workshop was actually put together and submitted as a proposal 9 months ago, and the world moves on. And it's those of you who watched this space may well have spotted last week that in Washington on the 22nd of September, heads of government from many nations, including Ghana, Kenya, no doubt some other African nations as well, and they signed up to an open government declaration. And if you haven't seen that, that's worth downloading. The reason I'm bringing it to your attention is the first thing that they've actually signed up within this declaration is to increase the availability of information about governmental activities. And when you read the text, which is underneath that, that is directly relevant to this workshop. So what we actually have in the 9 months since we've put the proposal together and submitted it, is we have a huge up push from civil society right across the world. Now we have a downward top level push. What is really missing across the world, in fact, is a global policy on how this can actually be dealt with, and that's what we're trying to address through this workshop. Now, the workshop is very structured. It's going to ask 3 questions about whether there should in fact be a public sector information or open government data framework. In other words, how do you actually implement and deliver this high level, or what the bottom-up community desire is. It's actually the substance in the middle which we're actually looking at. And we're using this workshop as a test, if you like, of your opinion as to whether now is the time to start seeing what we should do to bring a global policy into place, or whether it's too early and we should wait a little longer. That's really the context of what we're actually going to do. So the first question we're going to debate is that I'm going to ask each of the panel to give me up to 3 bullet points on this particular question. Is there a need for a global policy on public sector information, open government data policy, similar to that adopted by the OECD and the European Union, that had been adopted by 50+ United Member States? So I'm going to start with Anne.
I guess I would really say that it is really time now to move on to develop at a global level a set of general high-level principles about access to public sector information. The OECD recommendation and declaration, if I refer here to the OECD declaration on access to public sector information, it's also necessary to look at their recommendation on access to publicly funded research output, so data that comes from publicly funded research. These are really quite complex documents, quite detailed in some ways, and perhaps what we really need is something that's stated at a more general level, but in the context of the internet, the digital economy, think what we can see is that there is a relatively clear picture emerging. It's understood internationally that we really can use the internet, we can use data that's collected, produced or funded by government in digital form for many beneficial purposes. And I think that it's probably time to have this reflected in some more generally accepted statement of principles worldwide.
Okay, my answer to that question will be no, not yet. Simply because I believe that PSI is part of a wider information policy that needs to be there in a country. And if I look at the map of the e-readiness or information policy readiness of the UN member states, I think at the moment there are less than half of the countries who have some general e-government or information policy in place. So, and unless you have these basics in place, I believe it will be very difficult to come up with PSI, because PSI to me is something that is quite an advanced strategy to make economic reuse from public information. And of the 194 countries so far, less than 50% have any kind of information policy in place, and also have this freedom on the internet, freedom on the net, which is maybe a prerequisite to make use of public information. So that would be my answer, and I think for those countries who want to develop national policies, the existing framework by the OECD is a very good reference. And I remember when this was published in 2008 in Seoul, it was also explicitly mentioned that this OECD guidelines were meant for anybody, for any nation who wishes to adopt such a policy. So it's an open recommendation strategy, and it has a very exhaustive guidelines on what to do. And of course you can say that less developed countries may have difficulties to implement the whole policy, but perhaps they can pick parts of it and then start it. Yeah. So so I would say too early for a worldwide policy. Maybe we need a few more years with good examples also from emerging countries how they do it successfully.
Well, what I would say is that while there can be no arguments with regard to the need for an open government policy across the world, but at the same time we'll have to articulate and we have to work out the roadmap towards reaching that goal. If at the moment in which we are standing now, if we say that either the OECD imposed public PSI policy for open government is something which is the best which is to be adopted, then it will be, I would say, a bit premature to say that. We'll have to see the individual situations in various countries. Today, I don't think any country or any democracy in particular is not for open government, because open government is understood to bring in efficiency, bring in transparency, bring in accountability, and governments across the world are trying to strive these goals. So while these underlying principles of open government are accepted worldwide, but how do we reach the level of open government that some countries of the world have already reached? We'll have to work out that roadmap, we'll have to create a toolkit, and we'll have to work out individual country-specific paths to achieving that. If that is not done, then there might be countries who might react very differently to such things, and whatever gains would have been possible otherwise might not have been achieved. So as far as India is concerned, we are of course committed to an open government policy. We are working on an open data policy in which we feel that putting up the entire data, entire information with regard to public sector enterprises, with regard to whatever the government does with the taxpayers' money, that is a fundamental principle for good governance. And we have already enacted the Right to Information Act, which provides all information to be provided in the public domain. And there is a very particular section in the RTI Act of 2005, which says that it will be the endeavor of all government departments, of all public sector entities, to put all government data which is created with taxpayers' money in an electronic format and be made available through a network, which will be accessible for all. So this underlying principle of the RTI Act is at the core of our open data policy, and it we are committed to providing all information to all citizens in a very open format, in standardized metadata sets, so that innovators can use this data for building up applications which can really help deliver services. And we are also in the process of enacting a right to electronic services bill at the moment, which mandates that all public services will be delivered mandatorily in an electronic form in the next 5 years. So as far as India is concerned, we do have a policy in place for going up to the open government stage. But as far as the worldwide policy is concerned, I would say that we'll have to study individual countries, we'll have to work out roadmaps, and maybe a toolkit will be the first thing to start with. Thank you.
Well, my thoughts have already been expressed by Mr. Abhishek Singh very rightly. Of course, there is a need for a global policy framework as far as open government data is concerned. But at the same time, while the points have already been discussed, I believe that we should also have a provision for a globally consistent reporting framework. The framework developed by the Global Reporting Initiative for CSR and related activities by corporations can serve as a guideline for a broader reporting framework by public sector entities also. And if we can ensure a mechanism which can actually rightly ensure it ensures that we can end the exclusive arrangements that distort competition in the market. So these are the 2 points perhaps that can be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panel. I also have an input from the Spanish government, who are part of this workshop but were unable to appear here. So I'm going to read out what they've actually sent as their response to question 1. Their response is: a shared global framework on public sector information, reuse and open data would be desirable. The OECD and European Union frameworks could serve as a reference, but more benchmarking and bench learning would be needed. Shared standards and minimal principles on formats, licenses and interoperability would be very helpful. Now, that's from the panel. Next, we'd like to ask Keisha whether there's anything remotely, please.
No. Nothing remotely. From remote, no.
Okay, then we'll open it up to the floor. So what we're interested to hear from you is whether you think it's right at the right time, no, or other views. Who would like to start? Please give your name first.
Ahmed Ibrahim from Somalia.
Transcript stopped.
Yeah, I think there's never good time. We just have to start from somewhere. And the idea that if we say we're not ready, I just feel like we'll be saying we're not ready in 10 years' time too. So the sooner we start something, the better. I was in Washington a week ago when I was talking about the open data project that Kenya launched. And the same questions were asked. In other words, are we ready and all these things? And I said, look, it's up to you. We can always keep measuring, but where we are, we're ready to do whatever we have to do. And what we were missing, in fact, was the data itself that we don't have. It's in the UN or the World Bank or somewhere. So in summary, I guess it's the journey of 1,000 miles. We just have to take the first step. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that it's a process. And I think that while we have the OECD document which is out there, I'm not sure, because I haven't read it yet, whether it addresses the process issues as well. And I think that what we need to start with is a sort of evaluation, benchmarking, as our colleagues from Spain said, benchmarking to see the level of open readiness, we could say. And that would allow countries to assess really what would be their path, what would be their roadmap to getting to where they need to get to. Obviously, there's so much difference in the OECD context with our context that we are not going to be able to pick it up in that way. If we look at the way information flows currently, you see that there seems to be huge repositories of data in North America and in Europe that people are accessing, and that we have a long way to go in creating the content. I haven't looked at the question, so I don't know if the licensing issue is coming up later. Is it? Okay, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks. Oh, sorry, I should have said my name is Dorothy Gordon, and I'm from the Ghana-India Kofi Annan Center of Excellence in ICT.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, while you're just thinking, and I'll give you an input from the UK, from the Jim Retham, Head of Information Policy in the UK National Archives. This is the group of people who deliver the policy of implementing public sector information reuse in the United Kingdom, and also they act as the regulator. And his response, or their response to this, is information knows no boundaries, and a consistent approach to open data licensing and formats across geographical boundaries will stimulate the development of intercontinental information products and services. So that's his first point. The second point is the promotion of best practice and agreed standards will minimise administrative efforts for public sector information holders. This will lead to cost savings and enable information products to be brought to the marketplace that much quicker. The third point they wish to make is the removal of obstacles will result in a wide range of information being accessible in a variety of different products and services, so leading to better informed policy making across the public sector. The fourth point is stimulating the information industry will bring economic benefits. And the fifth point is increasing access across frontiers will lead to greater transparency and democratic engagement across the world. Now, while I've been reading that out, has anybody else like to contribute at this stage? Now, I'd like you to, yes, please.
My name is Sam Aguyo from Kenya. We launched the open data last July, and I've been following it on various discussion forums, and it has generated a lot of debate. First, people did not realize what open data is in the first place, but then it's opening opportunities for entrepreneurs who would be willing to use the data, reuse it, mash it up, and come up with solutions.
How many Kenyans are in the room? How many Kenyans are in the room? Have all the people from Kenya actually looked at it? Have you all looked at data? You have? Yes? What do you think of it? Either of you? No response.
One thing that generated a lot of discussions is some of the info is old. And yes, and still there are opportunities, even if the info is old, but there are opportunities. Like there are some people who might be interested in when that data is mashed up, there are opportunities in realizing some historical information, so to speak.
I'm not from Kenya, but actually I looked at it and I was following this program even before it was launched for another reason. And I look at it almost every second day for a variety of reasons. I think there's a lot of information there, and maybe some of the data might not be up to date, but that's not really the point. The point is the information is there, and it's just a matter of updating it. But my only concern is, first of all, the marketing and how many people know about it, especially at the educational or academic sector. And then the other issue is, what do you do with it? In other words, it's a very powerful tool, and there's a lot of data that you can use for decision making, for policies, and so on. So there is a need for education and in the public sector and also in the universities for people to know. There's a lot of research stuff there. Now, my interest was, in fact, expanding it to the whole Horn of Africa and getting Ethiopia, Somalia, Uganda, Tanzania, what have you. And that was the reason I was talking to the people in Washington. We will get there. So it's just a function of time, and that's why I'm trying to push things and say, look, we should never worry about e-readiness or whatever. There's always gaps, and we will always be in different stages. So let's just start. So what Kenya has done, I think it's an amazing outcome. Thank you.
I don't think the issue is whether or not we should launch open data services. The issue is, at this stage of the game, do we feel, and let me just pretend that I speak for Africa, do we feel in Africa that we have enough information and experience to negotiate effectively in the context of a global policy? Or are we going to find ourselves being forced to adopt a set of standards that are not actually as relevant as they should be to our context? So I think that's the issue which is on the table, is the question of whether or not we're ready for a global policy at this stage. And I think that we are not ready for that. And what we should do is to have a clear roadmap to prepare ourselves for that. You know, and yes, we have no objection to using the OECD as an inspiration, but it is an inspiration, and it is only through the practical implementation of open data that we're going to be able to see what are some of the issues that should go into the global policy from the African perspective.
In fact, if I may, can I elaborate a little bit? In fact, what is to be understood is that an open data policy or an open government policy is not just about building a portal or building a data.gov, or it should not be done just because you want to just bring in more transparency in what we do. That are also important, but what is more also important is that for an open government policy, there are governance issues, there are legal issues, there are economic issues, social issues that has also to be addressed. Once you are doing that, you should be conscious that when you are putting data in the public domain, how it is to be done. What are the governance issues? How do you mandate that all relevant data of all public departments are actually put? It should not become just like certain set of data sets which are not relevant also are put. And so people are just said that yes, we do have an open data policy, but the data which is there might not be relevant. There might be certain data sets which are left out. So when a country decides to go in for an open government domain or an open data domain, what is very important is that we address these very issues. What are the things that we will put? What are the things that we will not put? How will it be used? Whether it will be free to use for innovators within, or whether it will be available for only people who have the expertise of using this data outside the country. So these issues have to be addressed. That's why I said that each country will have to have its own roadmap, will have to identify its own issues, and in the usual parlance, if we say they'll have to do an as-is and to-be analysis, yes, what they want to be, that is sure, but how long it will take to go to that, whether they are in a position to right now adopt a policy which is in vogue in the OECD countries or any other country, that is a call which individual country has to take it itself.
If I may be allowed to say, unless we have a shared consensus as to how we want to organize our data across countries, within departments as well. So the issue of interoperability is also something that we need to focus on. So unless we have a minimum, unless we maintain a certain minimum standards as to how we organize our data, the data sharing cannot happen in the first place. And in the Indian context, if I may be allowed to say, why do we need to, and this is, of course, this is addressed to Mr. Abhishek Singh, why do we need to file an RTI? The data belongs to the citizen, and of that it is going to go to the public for their larger good. So why not we make it available just by default? So these are the two concerns.
Just need to clarify a point. The OECD policy principles are a recommendation for countries themselves to implement in the way they see fit. We're not talking about some world process where everybody has to conform. That's not what we're talking about. The only place in the world where there is a legal requirement to implement it is in the European Union. And that is made up of over 40 countries, with the countries which are associated to the European Union. And if you look at the European Public Sector Information Platform, there is a wealth of information of how these countries have got on. Some have had difficulties. There are over 23 languages spoken in Europe, so they've got language differences, they have GDP differences, they have population differences, density of population city-wise. You know, all that variety is there. If you then couple that with some other places around the world, like New Zealand and Australia, Canada, and some South American ones, you start to actually see that there's a lot of information that you can actually study, look at, and cherry pick if you wish. And for those of you who do not speak English, you say you speak Spanish, then I recommend that you actually look at the Aporta portal project. In Spain, it's all in Spanish, And that is telling you all about how, not just about how Spain is doing it, but it also translates other things from English into, and other languages into Spanish. Now I'd like to move on to the second question. So thank you for all of you for answering or considering the first one. So now we're actually going to consider, if you have said no to the question, the panelists, this is in the first instance, what do you think needs to happen first or next before you could move towards a potential global policy? If you have said yes, then what do you think the next steps? So we'll start again with Anne, please.
Thanks, Chris. I have to admit, I don't think we've really got any clear path ahead. And I think this is exactly the point that Dorothy Gordon has raised, that we really need a process to really develop a roadmap towards some global policy. I believe that we really do need to start developing some global policy framework, but we don't really have any process in place to begin doing that at this stage. Some countries, and I guess Australia, where I come from as an example, really have not been addressing this in an international or even a regional kind of context, although we've worked cooperatively with colleagues in New Zealand. Unlike the European Union, we don't have the advantage of working in cooperation with many other countries to develop ideas, policies, practices in this area. Nevertheless, much of the information, much of the government data that we really want to be able to make available or to access from other countries has got transboundary significance. We can think of areas, you know, such as environmental information. We can think of some economic, some health information, etc. Issues about epidemics. So, by definition, much of the data that governments have is not just something that's of interest to people within their own boundaries, but it is actually transnational. It's international in significance. And I think we need to work perhaps towards developing a process. I don't really have an easy answer as to how we begin that process. It seems to me that entities such as the Internet Governance Forum provide at least one avenue for doing that. For the developed countries, obviously this can be progressed further through the OECD, through the European community has really done a lot of work in developing its framework for access to public sector information, maybe through regional economic groupings. But it's very important to understand that this is not just a matter for governments. This cannot really just be top-down. It has to, in fact, involve civil society. It has to involve the innovators. A lot of the momentum in this area has come from non-government entities, often quite small organisations. So we have to have quite an inclusive approach, I think, in taking this forward.
Yes, what needs to happen? I think even within the governments, there is a large lack of awareness. So let's say, for instance, in Hong Kong, we have 90 plus government agencies, but only 2 actually take part in a prototype to put the data into a portal where citizens and business people can reuse this. And if you talk to government officials in any country, I'm sure there are very few who know about PSI and the implications of PSI. So I think what is always forgotten in this whole discourse about PSI is how do we educate the civil servants? How do we make them excited about this? How do we encourage them that this is a really new thing that creates value between the government and the civil society and the business world? I think that is, and also the question is, I mean, also in India you have several hundred government agencies. Why should they bother? So I think there's a lot of education and awareness that we need to do for the civil servants, because if we don't get them on board, it's additional work for them. Why should they do it? So that's one thing. But on the other hand, we also need to do a lot more marketing in the business community and in the civil society. Because I mean, if you talk to people who are outside this very open government and PSI circle, I'm sure very few people know about this. It's a very small discourse in a very limited circle at the moment. And I think we need to do a lot of, the EU is doing a great work on promoting this now. With Nelly Kroes and so on, but in other countries, I think we still have a long way to go. And I just want to make one comment. What I meant was not ready. With not ready, I meant that many countries don't have the digital infrastructure. They don't have the standardized metadata sets. They don't have information governance. And so it is, I mean, if you look at information records in these different departments, there's a lot of work to do. And that's what I meant was not ready. It is like you have to do a lot of fundamental work in how is the information organized across the different government agencies, and how can we create then a platform where all this information can be really reused and in a consistent way. Yeah, thank you.
In fact, what I would say is that when you look at the countries, the spectrum of countries, there can possibly be there only 3 kinds of countries which are there. One which have already adopted the policy, one which are in the process of, they are wanting to, but they are looking into the pros and cons, and there might be some countries who would be as a policy opposed to an open government policy, because we do have different kind of governance structures across the world. So in order to ensure that all countries do come up to a policy wherein more and more information with regard to the public services are put in open domain, what will be required is that to begin with we should create a knowledge repository with regard to how the open data and open government is created. How does it happen? What are the metadata standards with regard to various government data which is put in the public domain? What are the policies with regard to interchange of this information within departments? How do citizens access that? How is the data analyzed? So all these standards can be put in a global kind of repository in which the countries which have already done these things, countries which have already gone through the learning curve, they can share their best practices, they can share their knowledge that they have acquired in this field into the repository, which is available for other countries to see. And then the other thing which will be required is that how these countries have benefited from these initiatives, how putting data into an open domain, how making the government open has actually improved governance, has actually improved efficiency, has actually brought in transparency, has allowed for public participation, has allowed for citizens to be engaged with the government in finalizing public policies, which might not have anything to do with IT, but whether it's health related policies, education related policies, how are we actually getting in the citizens to buy in with the public policy, and no government which is working for the welfare of the people will dispute from that. So if all these learnings are put in a global repository, then at the policy level more and more governments will feel inclined towards adopting a open government policy. And the second thing, as was also mentioned, was that the level of awareness building and level of capacity building that will be required to achieve that will be huge. We will have to work at various levels of the government, because there are skill sets which are to be built, there are attitudinal changes which are to be built. People have to understand that while doing so, you are not letting go of any discretion or any powers that you had, but you are actually making your own task simpler, because once citizens are aware of what the government does and why it does and how it does, the appreciation for the government's actions and decisions will be better. Because once things are clouded in secrecy, then there are all kinds of apprehensions that what might have led to a public decision or not. So that on that count also, we need to work a lot with regard to change management, with regard to capacity building. Maybe we will have to organize regional workshops, trainings of all kinds, so that people in all levels are brought up to a particular level. And the third, I think, that will need to be done is that one will have to actually look in. It's not putting data in the open domain is not the end all of the whole policy. Ultimately, any data which is put in the public domain is actually leading to a service. So citizens are more interested in what kind of service they are getting from that. So if that linkage is well established, that like if you put say the rainfall data in the public domain, then there might be innovators, there might be people who would use this data to work out prediction models, and they will start giving a service to the people, which can be offered through multiple platforms, through mobile phones which are growing across the world. So then people will feel the need for it, they will feel what benefits it brings, and then there will be both a demand side and supply side push. So the government will also be interested in pushing into an open government policy from the supply side, and from the demand side there will be an increasing demand from the citizens who will be craving for more and more data and more services through this data, which will ultimately help different governments to come up to a level where they will feel that yes, we do need to have a policy on open government, whether it's a global policy or not, but yes, at least a national policy will be something that will be felt need. And then of course, once that is done, the next step will be that how do we integrate this to bring in the benefits which comes in for global sharing by having a common global policy on this regard. Thank you.
I think Mr. Singh has already covered all the points that I really wanted, but I think the supply and demand aspect that he has all very beautifully, very delineatedly he has elaborated. But the two issues that I think need to be kind of taken into consideration. One is the technical part of it, which we have already discussed in our previous set of question discussion. We have done that about interoperability and organizing the metadata or the standards that we may have one standard across, because India is a country with a very intense diversity, so the challenges are much more higher there. So that's one aspect of it, and the other is the mindset. So perhaps the capacity building exercises, the symposia, the workshops, the sharing of the best practices are the ways where we can actually think of kind of having a shared vision about open data. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. The input from the Spanish government for this question is the IGF could be a forum where a common set of shared high-level principles could be discussed and developed. Other international and regional fora could take these principles as a starting point. Is anything remote? Keisha?
No, there isn't.
Okay. The input from the British government for this question. The first point is an agreed set of open data principles that would underpin the global approach to information. The United Nations could invite countries to contribute examples of best practice in the areas of data formats and standards, licensing, inventories and regulatory frameworks. This would form the basis of practical guidance and standards that would form the basis of templates on which countries could base national practice. And the third point they make, it is important to establish clear criteria against which success should be measured. Clarity on what the process of assessment would be and who would be assessing is essential. Open now the debate back to the floor for question 2. Who would like to start? Yes?
Bevel Wooding. I've been doing outreach in the Caribbean region with regard to awareness in the use of and the importance of open data. And I think the issues raised by the panelists in this particular question build upon what was commented on earlier in terms of the requirement for there to be relevant participation, particularly from those countries that have not yet fully embraced or understood open data, if we have to move toward an open data global policy of any kind. I also want to echo the sentiments expressed by my colleague from Somalia, is it? Who said that we have to start doing something. And I really feel, and in working with the Trinidad and Tobago government, for example, the use of practical working models of how open data applies to government is a big part of communicating what open government is. Part of what my NGO does is we create applications that can then be used by civil society and by governments. And in doing so, we are communicating to government that you are sitting on a gold mine, and that gold mine is a public resource. Open data fits in that context because it is part of government's responsibility to make this information available to its citizens, and governments, particularly in resource-constrained environments, don't always have the capacity to take advantage of the information that they own and that they hold in public trust. And so that is part of how we have been communicating the value of and the requirement for open data policies at a national level, because we understand that it will not achieve or receive national attention until there is some proof of concept as to what it is, what is the value, and why must scarce public resource and attention be applied to it. And so I just wanted to reinforce the need to have, number one, multi-stakeholder participation as part of the open data movement. Two, the fact that government generic will never pay attention to open data until there is something specific inside of government that catches the attention of those who can make it a national policy. And that normally happens in smaller use cases or smaller context. And three, to certainly for the Caribbean region, for it to become something that engages the region, there has to be relevant application within the public space. In other words, citizens must say, this is something we value, you need to provide more of it. And that's where the applications and civil society and the entrepreneurs come into the mix.
Thank you. I've just noticed that we actually have Jim Retham on screen, so he's actually connected inside. So do you hear us, Jim? Could you activate it? Can you hear Jim? No. Yes, please go ahead, Jim. Would you like to make a response to some of the items you've heard so far, please? Sorry, Jim, you're actually breaking up, so I think we can't hear you very clearly. So I think we probably need to just halt you there for a moment. Is that okay? Can you actually communicate via text to Keisha? Okay. Is there any other input from the audience? Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from Semacraft Consulting Partners. Open data, is an ideal destination, I think, for most countries in Africa and most countries in emerging markets and emerging democracies. But there's still a long way to go before certain other fundamental frameworks are in place. I like the position of the British government for the need probably to first adopt a global set of principles that are the basic minimum. And I think the Open Government Partnership provides a good place to start, and then build the capacity of regional blocks to further fine-tune those and make them relevant to their local contexts. One of the things that I have noticed is that even within the new Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, and the African Union, the conversation of open data has not received as much amplification as would be expected, and yet this is the single place on the planet that I'd think it would be a big conversation. But that's a sign that there's a lot of work that needs to be done first before a global policy is put in place. But it could start with guidelines that are backed by the UN and then encouraged, as a place to start by regional blocks and countries. One of the weak areas, I think, also is the absence of national ICT policies that define some of the basic minimums, like government information exchange, how within the government how information flows, and then beyond that, eventually how government information is passed on to the public, consumed, reused, redistributed, and consumed beyond the borders. So adequate legislation to make sure that open data is made available and that the integrity of that data is maintained is part of the initial basic minimum guidelines that personally I'd like to see in place before a government can adopt a UN policy globally. Thank you.
To contribute? Can I go back to the, yes, Ms. Keisha?
I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that is really important is to include a technical community, because even though government mightn't be emphasizing open data, a lot of times the technical community and the open source community in different countries are. And so there's a great need for them to help illustrate to government how that information that they have can be utilized. So there needs to be more of a collaborative kind of element. And by doing so, that could help to promote national policies and consequently global policy. So I think the technical aspect of it, the technical community and the open data community and those people that are already doing stuff, even if it's not with government data, also needs to be included.
Anybody else? Yes.
Bevel Wooding. Once again, on the note of technical involvement of the technical community, as we have to be very careful in terms of how the community is engaged, simply because what may start off as a small private project can essentially become the de facto standard for data, for metadata definition, for data access, particularly in the smaller countries. And so, again, going back to the issue of public awareness and general knowledge of emerging best practices in developing open data applications and services is going to be key, so that those who are taking the lead, particularly the entrepreneurs, the forward-thinking civil society groups, are aware of what some of the use cases are in other markets, so that those can be applied in creating innovations in their own local territories.
Can I just, thank you. Can I just ask the panel members whether any of you have like to respond to what you've just heard?
Yes, just to comment, I think we at the moment we don't have a good platform to share good practices in this field. Many of us maybe use the EPSI Plus from the European Union, but it would also be, which also includes some cases from outside Europe. But it would be nice to have a really global platform for PSI good practices and ideas, both from emerging countries and from countries who have already gone more experience. That would be certainly quite a useful tool.
For the underlying theme which is emerging from what the thoughts which are available is that, yes, there is no two questions with regard to the need for a policy, but how to go about it, that is critical. And building up of awareness and capacity building at all levels will be the key to it. And those countries which have already gone ahead, whether it's the OECD or the US or whatever, they have experimented with it, they would need to share the learnings that they have had, the standards that they have developed, which will be open for people to review and adopt if it suits them. But these things will have to be shared through a maybe a platform or a global repository, which some institution, either the UN or IGF or somebody, will have to come forward and say that yes, we are setting up this open data or open government exchange, which will be one common pool from where these resources can be picked up for adoption as and when the need arises.
Before I move on to the last question, can I just ask all of those of you who are here from Africa, from the African continent, what the question is to you: which African body would you actually suggest you work with to try and develop those? We've had some suggestions from the gentleman over here. Are there any others?
I think we're talking about a global.
We are, but
yes.
One of the steps might be regional.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to look at an approach which will be consistent across the globe. That, I mean, if you decide, say, you're going to go for African Union or an Economic Commission for Africa, or you're going to go for a NEPAD approach, it means that you're going to be mirroring a similar approach in other regions. So I would find it very difficult to make any clear recommendation on that. I think that the Open Government Partnership really gives us the location for the discussion. You know, people are signing up to it. It's got a lot of media attention. It's got high profile. This, for me, is a global partnership that is the right location for the discussion.
Thank you. Any other input before we move to the next question? Okay, we're going to move on to question 3 now then, for the panel first. And the question is for them to rank 3 items which are key. In other words, to prioritise what actions would be, or what parts of the policy would you address first. So if I start with Anne, please.
One thing I think is important to make clear in moving ahead with the open government data agenda is that it's not necessary to work up a fully fledged freedom of information or right to information system in order to be able to progress with this. So rather than putting a lot of effort, time and resources into developing a right to information system, which I guess takes up a lot of resources, you can actually move ahead with the open government agenda in a much more straightforward way. Now, some fundamental things that I think would have to be part of any policy are a principle that when you provide access, the material that's made accessible is also going to be able to be used and reused. There should be a principle that openness is the default unless otherwise justified. So an open government data system, I think, has actually got to operate above a platform which already looks at and takes into account and puts in place proper protections for security, privacy and other issues. Also, I would say that in many cases standards are something that need to be dealt with at that level as well, so information technology standards. So we're really talking about building something that sits on top of an underlying platform that's already established. I think if we don't do that, it's very hard to bring everything into an open government data policy. The other thing that's important is to identify restrictions and to look at ways of removing those. And one of the areas in which I've been most closely involved is looking at restrictions that have been imposed or justified by virtue of the existence of copyright, government copyright. So if in fact we can say we don't need to remove government copyright entirely, but we can in fact work with it by using some open licensing methodologies, and in our case we've used the open content licensing that's provided by the Creative Commons licenses to enable a lot of public sector information and data to be made available, not only for access but for use and reuse.
Okay, my recommendations would be the first, start with a small prototype and learn as you go along. So I think it's quite a good strategy not to develop 5 years the big master plan for public sector information, but really maybe start with a few government agencies who want to try out and see how it works, and then learn as you go along. And also, during that process, I think it is very important to create a community, a vibrant community of developers, people from the community, citizens, also academics, and the business community, of course, so that you have a kind of a self-organized community of people who care about open government data and who take this idea further to and scale up. And the second point I would make is that PSI somehow needs to be linked to national innovation policy. At the moment, most government put this into the IT departments, but actually it's not about IT, it's about information. And the whole PSI for me is a service innovation or a user-generated innovation, because it only lives if the users come up with ideas and use the stuff that is in these repositories. So that means ultimately it's about a new form of service innovation which which exists because government and society and business talk to each other and create something new in the moment they use it. So that's therefore I think it should be much more linked to national innovation policy. And the third one I think has also been stressed already a lot of times is that we do need more awareness and skills training, capacity building within the governments, because the mindset still is very often, even if you have e-government and open government data policy, many civil servants still think that they're kind of afraid of releasing the data, or they think the data is not high quality. There are many obstacles and in the mindset of civil servants to release data, and we need to have more trainings to increase the awareness on what's the benefit of doing it for the whole community. Thank you.
Well, I would say that the first and foremost principle, if we decide to embrace open data and an open government policy, is to realize that it's not about technology. It's not about building a data.gov portal. It's more about a fundamental policy change which makes the government believe that whatever information it has, whatever data it has to be shared with the citizens, with the population at large. And this, given the level of development of information infrastructure across the world, and given the issues of access and diversity that we have in the internet domains and the internet age that we have, I would still feel that the need for a right to information policy, the right systems for giving information to people will be something which will be required as a first step. There are many countries which, if they straight away start putting data in an open domain, then they would face challenges of access, and people who do not have access, they will be deprived of that information. So the right thing will be to first have a right to information framework to ensure that yes, whatever we are going to do with an open government or open domain forum is imbibed in our policy framework, in the legislation, in the laws, in the regulations that we have. And then of course move on to, once that information is, the government decides that in principle I am willing to share all information that we have with the citizens, then the next step will be to make this information made available in electronic domain through an open data platform or a portal. So the institutional changes, the fundamental policy level changes will be something which should precede the development of an open government or open data platform. The second most important thing is that data, as I had said earlier also, data has to be linked to services. That how does this putting of data in an open domain or giving information to people in an open domain actually benefit the citizens and the customers of the government? This would require releasing not only data but also APIs or tools with which this data can be analyzed, and allowing people to build up applications which will help deliver more services. The government can do for the public services by its own, but at the same time should allow the private sector entrepreneurs, the innovators, to use this data to build up mashable applications which will help in rendering of more services with the help of the data which has been brought in the open domain. And the third, which has already been mentioned by my fellow panelists, is the need for awareness building with regard to the advantages of an open government system or open data system, and capacity building across the various levels of government and even the public sector entities, so that everyone involved with holding of data which we hold in on behalf of citizens, that we are trained and equipped to be able to analyze that data and organize and put it up in a format which is usable for citizens, and at the same time work on a change management programs to ensure that the attitudinal changes which are required, wherein the thought that data belongs to the government and doesn't to the people, that change is brought out. So these three are the key fundamental issues which I would say need to be addressed to begin with.
In fact, at the outset, I would really like to mention that we have to understand that the government does not, many of us have the perception and we believe that the government owns the data. The government does not own the data. Government kind of has, it acts like a custodian to data. And with this assumption, I would like to put across 3 points. First, the government, the decision makers in the governments across various departments, I'll be speaking in the Indian context, they need to be convinced about the fact that open data is for the public good. And once this acceptance is there, there has to be a detailed roadmap that needs to be sketched out for transition of the open data to the public domain. And then there is also at the other level, we have to also see that the demand is created, the need for having an open data is created, and it can be created only through the capacity building workshops, and we have to use a lot of public fora for sharing the information, the benefits, and how and the mashing of the data, which kind of gives a greater advantage to the public good at large. And there was there was one more point that was, I mean, I have been kind of emphatically stressing on the fact that there has to have an interoperability. It will happen only when we have the data available in an open data format, and not all those proprietary and all those licenses that are required. Of course, at some point it is required for us to ensure that the data, the privacy or the security, I mean, those issues are there. We have to ensure mechanisms for it, but the data need to be available in open data format for everyone to use, for making it, for mashing the data and for leveraging on the data.
Thank you, panel members. Next, I would just like to read you what the Spanish government input is to this. And some of the points they would make. Start with cultural change within the public organisation. This is key. Then start with what you have. Allow the reuse of already published information. And the next one is progressively embed reuse and open data policies in your organisation, improving issues such as interoperability, formats and description, and identification of reusable data. The next one they suggest is assign responsibilities on reuse in each public organisation. Always work with your private sector and your civil society, taking advantage of new interaction tools between public and private sector and civil society, and building a multi-stakeholder community of open data promoters. The next point they make is establish default rules favourable to reuse authorisation, simple and easy reuse conditions, brackets, licensing, and charge no or minimal fees. And the last point they make is define strategies addressing possible threats of a new digital divide between those who are able to understand, combine and reuse open data and those who are not. The British input, British government input to this question is, the first point they would make is proactive release of data and information in reusable formats. The second one they make is clear and open license standards, with most information being available for reuse at marginal cost, that is nil charge in most cases. And the third point they make is the process should be transparent and open to challenge. In particular, there should be an underpinning regulatory and complaints process. So I can see from the four panelists and the two inputs from Spain and the UK, you can start to actually see commonality beginning to appear. Now I'd like to open it up to the audience. Who would like to start? Anybody?
Thank you very much for, I'm sorry about missing the first bit of it. I went over to another room by mistake, but so perhaps my question, you might have already addressed this issue. I'm just curious, so I appreciate all the issues that you've laid out, but what I haven't heard in this short period that I've been here is any discussion about the sort of target populations that you expect to be using the data, and if you think it's necessary at this point from the very beginning to start thinking about inclusion or marginalized communities and how they can use this data. Thank you.
The lady at the back. You need to come to a microphone, please. I'll give your name first. Thank you.
Two small questions. Recently, I was in a least developing country talking with the statistical agency people there, and their concern seems to be, we have been selling our data, and that's how we sustain ourselves. Can you offer us an economic model so that we can open up our data and still be able to sustain ourselves? Because that's a requirement by our authorities. Number two, I would like to have some advice on if you're approaching open government data in a developing country, what sort of agencies would you go and knock on doors? Is it the statistical agencies? Is it the Ministry of Finance? Is it the ICT? Is it the finance or higher councils? And I'd like to benefit from your experience. Thank you.
Could you just give your name, please?
I'm from the IDRC, Maria Ng, from the Singapore office of IDRC. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other inputs? The lady here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, you.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we are hitting on some fundamentals here, things which we could work on, which are design principles, first for data. And I think that that is something that we can negotiate together, we can start, but not that it has to be a formal agreement that people have signed to. Because as some of the panelists have mentioned, if we don't get that fundamental right, it will be very difficult to fix later on when we actually want to start sharing at, cross-border, let's put it that way. But I would like the panelists to comment on some of the very iffy issues to do with open data, issues to do with citizen privacy, and issues to do with commercial agreements that we've seen as problematic in some of the contexts which are already far advanced. I see this to be one of the most tricky areas as we go for cross-border sharing, because different countries have very different approaches to this and notions around this. These are some of the things which will become tricky as we negotiate.
Thank you. Don't forget to give your name. Okay.
Thank you very much, the panel. I appreciate the way the discussion we are on open data. In Kenya government took initiative to have an open data, and there's still some little bit bottlenecks here and there, because if you look at it, the government believes that if they release the data so much to the consumers, it will expose them. So they preferably try to conceal some of the data which is very useful to the citizen or the consumers at the other end. For example, you may want, like, open data will help in agricultural sector or even in the transport industry. But sometimes the government don't give all the details. They try to conceal the information to the citizens, and also they try to make it look like what the government is doing is much better than it can be improved to be much better than what they are saying. So I think there's still a loophole which needs to be rectified. Another end is, if we look at the open data, the consumers in the developing countries, mostly, you find that they cannot even reach a place where they can access that data, which need to be addressed in this forum. I think we can, because of the energy issues, you find that those who can access internet, for example, in developing countries, they are affected by the supply of energy. So the information which they should be able to get at the tip of the fingers cannot reach them because of the insufficient energy. So that is another point I think we need to check on this forum. And also, there's a lady who raised from IDRC raised a very important issue there. I think in open data, we need to know, like, what the governments in developing countries do. They try to look at the development partners. But I think we need to address the issue of, when we are dealing with the open data, is it the government only to deal with, or we have other agencies within the country? Right. Thank you.
Could you just give your name for the record, please?
Thank you. My name is Daniel Omondi. I work for Doto Computer Agency.
Thank you.
In Nairobi.
Gentleman over here.
Hi, Andy Smith from the British Computer Society. but I actually do quite a lot of work in government. One of the things that comes across to me, I mean, if you take the developing countries, or developed countries, should I say, like the US, Germany, the UK, we've now got thousands and thousands of pages of information, knowledge, real information assets that we're now putting up online. And we've got sort of an open policy, so we're now putting up more and more information. But what I'm wondering is if there is a way of actually making this available in a more coherent fashion to developing countries, so that they can learn from our mistakes rather than having to relearn or re-go through all of the things that we've been through. If you look at a lot of the stuff we've done in finance, in developing of healthcare, social welfare systems, a lot of that information is now being made available, now being put up online. But how can we share that? How can we make it available to developing countries in such a way that they can use it and they can speed up their development through using those information assets and that knowledge that we've already developed and paid for?
Thank you. Is anybody else, before I pass it back to the panel, to comment? Okay, if I can ask the panel, do you have comments? Would you like to comment on what you've just heard, please?
I just want to comment on the question on the target population. I think that's a very a good question, because if we don't manage to create applications that are interesting for a large portion of the population, then PSI will remain a very topic for a few insiders, but it will not be really have a large reach. But one of the most popular applications in PSI seems to be traffic information, and I think nearly everybody is using some kinds of transport medium most days. So I think from the experience that we see from countries that have PSI already in place, everything around real-time traffic data, real-time transport information is very successful, and you only need a relatively simple mobile phone to access this kind of information. And the immediate usefulness of that application is quite clear. Yeah. But there are, of course, so I think it's good to have an application that makes immediate sense to a lot of people, and then you can build other applications which are maybe more focused on particular populations. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. In fact, on the same issue, as I said, that was one of the challenges which many countries face, is that once you go for an open data framework and open government policy, is it that you are serving only a particular section of the society, and are the people who do not have access to basic information infrastructure, are they being denied that information? To that extent, that's why in one of the 3 points which we were supposed to address, I said that first, to have the information policy which gives a citizen a right, whether he has access to an information infrastructure in the electronic format or not, he should have a right to get the data and information which he desires, even in the manual format. So that can be the beginning point, because that will reinforce the policies the government has, that yes, the data which is there with us is, we are just the custodian on behalf of citizens, and any citizen, whosoever it is, whether he is living in a remote area or an area which doesn't have access to maybe power or connectivity, he also has access to that information. That will be the fundamental principle to begin with. And of course, the ultimate goal of building providing all data through a network and through an electronic format, that will be achieved. So that way, inclusiveness of all sections of society is a paramount importance. And we in India are in fact trying to achieve this, because we face these fundamental problems, because a lot of our villages do not have access to reliable connectivity and even power supply. So what we have done is that we have set up a network of kiosks, which we call common services centers, which are spread out in the rural areas, and they provide access to internet, access to services to the rural population who might not have access directly. So citizens are able to access these services at these centers. So that is what we do. The second point which I would like to address is with regard to the query with regard to building a business model for especially the least developed countries, which might which might genuinely feel that it's their data, and if their data is being used by developers from other countries who will build applications and who will build a revenue model out of that data. So these are issues which the individual countries will need to address, because not all countries will have a lot of developer community who will use this data to earn revenue from that. So countries will have to build in policies with regard to how this revenue sharing is built up, so that anyone who is using your data to build up a business case or to build up a revenue model in which he builds up an application or delivers a service by using that data, he may be required to share a part of that revenue with the government in question. So again, that will be a national issue, because of course the cost of access of these services will go up, because if the country is getting a part of the revenue, so each individual government will have to take a call on that. So if in principle they feel that if their data is being used for driving revenue, they can always demand a share from that. And the other questions with Dorothy in fact mentioned with regard to the issues of privacy and issues of commercial agreements. So privacy is something which is again in many ways a cultural issue. What might be considered to be in the domain of privacy in one community or one country might not be so in another country or community, and that again brings us to the issue of need for national policies to begin with, how we are going to address privacy issues as we build up a global policy on open data or open government, and then try to see is there a common minimum standard with regard to privacy issues which can be part of the global policy framework. So again, the need for having a national roadmap, a national policy, and working on to what extent we will be partnering with the global policy on open government or open data, that will have to be taken into account. So there are no answers to this, but I would say that each country will have to look into their own privacy issues, their own privacy concerns, and ensure that that is addressed once they move on to a global framework for open data. The commercial agreements are something what I just mentioned with regard to the revenue agreements which have to be done. So each entity, each stakeholder in the whole game for open government and open data will have to ensure that they safeguard their own interests and they are not taken for a ride, and the benefits coming from the open data with regard to the revenues which will drive from this sector will have to be shared equitably between all stakeholders.
Any other panel member like to comment? No? I'd like to come back on the statistical point, first of all. An example you could take a look at, I'll give you two, and it's worth going online and looking at it. First is the Australian statistical body. They actually switched away from charging, went over to free use, brought in a series of applications to help. What actually happened inside the organisation, their costs went down. So, which is one of the points which is being made, that this is a way of reducing costs within the public sector. Another example is the Eurostat, the European statistical body, which collects all the statistics which you may be familiar with. They used to charge. They also reversed that situation, and suddenly the data took off. It was being used, and that was exactly the same in Australia. Now, to give you another example, which is not statistical, but is actually to do with cadastral information, this is about land registration. If you look at the Spanish cadastre, over a number of years, something like 7 or 8 years, they have slowly evolved the process. And what they did first, and I just want to make a qualifying statement, the Spanish cadastre reports to the finance ministry. So this has the financial backing. What they did is made all their data free, online, to anybody. So that was the first step, and that took a while to go. So what that immediately did, and those of you who are interested in green policies with regards to IT, it's cut out all people travelling to places to register in an office and all sorts of things like that. That has taken off. Now, as that took off, the entrepreneurs who started to use this information to add extra services said, what we need is not a single shot look at each land registration parcel or property registration. What we would like is regular bulk updates, and we would like to pay for that particular service, even though the data is free. The Spanish cadastre now has implemented that during this year. So they've actually now brought on the entrepreneurial side who needs regular updates of that information. So there are a lot of examples around where when you look at them, you can actually see benefits on both sides of the interface, on the public sector side itself and on the wider community. So if you don't want any more information, please contact me. Now, the point about privacy, both the European Union directive, if you read it, actually says this policy of public sector information reuse is dependent upon, and then it lists other legislation. And the first one is the European Union data protection law. The OECD principles are exactly the same. They say you have to comply with these other areas. So it's not a free-for-all. Now, what's difficult is that when you apply these rules in an open data context and you say you're on the public sector body side, I will release this for open use, it's not actually got anything which can identify a data subject in it. When it's mashed with other data, then it starts to become identifiable of a data subject. And that can be done by all sorts of means, because people produce applications which use newspapers. So all they do is look at newspapers, look to see what sort of things are going on, and they capture that, and then it's all geolocated, and before you know where you are, you know where it is. It's also very important in small rural communities, because in small rural communities, most people know everything about what's going on in that community anyway. So there are lots of different aspects to how you deal with privacy which are beyond the data protection law in itself. But there are many questions you're raising, and there are very many good examples around, and of course there are some which are negative to what you said. And if you take the European Union and the database on the European PSI platform, you will in fact find different countries in the European Union are applying the process differently. So if you take in one country, let's take the Spanish cadastre, you can find out who owns that land parcel. If you go to another country in the European Union, there is no way you can get that, because they say that bit of information is in fact a data subject, it's identifying a data subject. And there's lots of those sort of things, hence the need that why you begin to need a regional policy and a global policy, because you need to start to harmonize it. Otherwise, the entrepreneurs can't actually use the information, because as soon as they cross a boundary, they hit another set of issues, and they can't make their application function. So it's a very big subject, which we could talk about forever. We're running out of time, so I'd like to go back to the panel now to ask each of them to give us one quick point to sum up with. Please. Okay, it's what I would say is it's a complex area, but things are moving really quite rapidly. And I think from my own experience is that what we can say is that different countries, different states will achieve advances in different ways. So for example, we have achieved a lot of advance by using the simplified open content licensing. Look at how different countries, different states, different organisations achieve advance, and I think we can learn from each other.
I think PSI is one of the greatest opportunities for public sector innovation that we had in the past years. And I think we are just at the beginning of this new conversation and new engagement between government agencies and the society and citizens. And we need to have much more fantasy and interesting ideas to create these initiatives like bar camps and mashups where people create and prototype many ideas in a very short time. So, and I think it's not like open the data and they will come. That's happened in many European countries, that they have the PSI policy in place, but then nothing happens. So we need to create really a lot of excitement and also engagement around this whole process to get all these good ideas out that are there in the community. Yeah.
Well, I must say that open government is something that is the way to go, and governments would today or tomorrow embrace it. The important things that we'll need to address will be how open data helps in better delivery of services and how it drives innovation and allows entrepreneurs to build applications around that data for improving services per se. And the way to go for a for a policy framework around that, the beginnings, I would say, has already been made with the open data partnership, open government partnership, which has been initiated. 38 countries are already part of that. Very soon other countries will join in, and what this open government partnership should do is to put in the open domain the metadata standards and the standards with regard to various data sets that have been evolved and standardized. So as and when a country decides based on its national level of information infrastructure to embrace open government, they go ahead and adopt a similar metadata standards, so that the varying standards around data across countries does not become a bottleneck for entrepreneurs to develop applications which can work across regions and across countries. Thank you.
While there is no denial that open data has enormous, huge advantages for the government and for the public at large, I would suggest that as a civil society organization, how best we can avail the public information data for the stakeholders, and how best can we use, reuse, and distribute the data. And it can only happen when we have the data in a manner that can be accessed by a common individual, and that can be used for the larger good. And that's where the effective e-governance lies. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. There's no input from the Spanish government on this particular one. You have one, a remote one, Keisha?
I have a remote comment from Jorge, and he says, PSI is a big opportunity. Cultural change will be the key challenge, but social, democratic, and economic benefits are huge, growing, and at hand.
Okay, thank you. That's from Spain. Spain, isn't it? George. Okay, the British government final point they'd like to make is the spread of open data offers huge potential in terms of economic benefit and democratic engagement. The encouraging aspect is that public sector organisations across the world do not have to incur vast expense or resources to fulfil this potential, nor are we embarking on a voyage into the unknown. There are numerous examples across the world of best practice which can easily be adapted and followed. The promotion of open data will deliver benefits for the citizen, for business, and for the public sector itself. So that's all the input we have. We've run out of time, but I now would just like to take you back to the background document if you've not read it. You might wonder why it's got various things in it, like the access law, the data protection law, development of e-government, metadata standards, geospatial data infrastructures, because all of you have touched slightly on all of these, and that's why we actually included these in here, and we took it from the United Nations perspective of what the United Nations monitors. So we didn't take it from a European perspective or an Australasian perspective or a North American perspective. We looked at it from the global side downwards. In other words, what does the United Nations itself perceive? And of course, those of you who are watchers of the United Nations and the World Bank will know that they have themselves adopted open data policies, and they are developing those for the benefit of all. I'd like to thank all of you for your participation. I would really like to thank each member of the panel for your contributions. What will happen next is we will produce the report from this meeting. That will go up on the IGF website for this workshop. I will probably also edit or correct the transcript. So if when I publish that as an attachment to this workshop report, please, if I've got anything like a name spelt wrong or anything like that, please feel free to contact me. I don't mind. We all make mistakes. So thanks again. Please show your appreciation to everybody in the room.